Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm slightly overwhelmed, but I just wanted to say a few words and to say how grateful I am that the 92nd Y are covering this and have kindly put this event on. It really means a lot. And thank you to the panelists for reading and talking about her work. It's so nice at this stage to maybe think that new readers might come to her work and think of her in a different way than just the author of Rebecca, which obviously, you know, is her #1 bestseller, but still she did write other books. And these short stories mean a lot to me personally because they are psychologically really dark, and they will take you on a journey of storytelling that you just didn't know was going to happen. She talks about themes which still resonate now, which specifically I would urge you to start, well, it's the first story, The Blue Lenses, which you can interpret in many different ways, but also as a woman in her early 50s, I come to it with new eyes, thinking that it could also be adapted, possibly now, in a menopausal way. Who do you trust? Vulnerability, paranoia. All these themes are relative and are really important now, not just for women. Her stories are for men too. All genders, welcome. And I just hope that you enjoy these stories and you might want to read more of her work in the future. And, you know, you can read these stories not in one go, put them down, read them 2 months later. You don't have to read it all in one go. They can be your friend, take them with you and talk about them to your friends, get her work out there, you know, because it's nice for people not just to think of her as the author of Rebecca. I'm not doing Rebecca down, but these are different kind of stories, which I hope everyone will enjoy. And thank you very much. I hope you like the book. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for those opening remarks. I think you will find a lot of people here probably are already Daphne du Maurier lovers, but I hope by the end of the evening you will love her even more. The stories you mentioned today, where to begin? Well, a woman wakes from an operation to find everyone around her has transformed into an animal. A would-be serial killer finds his true passion in painting. A passive-aggressive wife returns to haunt her resentful husband from beyond the grave as an apple tree. Birds inexplicably turn on humans. I want to know if men realize when they are insane, says the narrator of The Doll. But really, it could be the question overhanging all of these stories, and I would say much of du Maurier's work in general. And it's a question that she will never answer to your complete satisfaction, and therein lies the pleasure. I mean, within this book, we have themes of place and repressed desire. We have claustrophobia and grief, the end of childhood. We have killer birds. We have murderous dwarves. We have alpine utopias. We have a menacing sex doll. those who think of Daphne du Maurier as merely a mistress of romantic suspense should know that she was indeed far, far more. As a biographical note, before we really get into it, just say that Dame Daphne du Maurier, Lady Browning by the end, born in 1907 to a very artistic and rather bohemian family, many writers, artists, and theatrical people, and wrote from a very young age. And her biggest success was, of course, Rebecca, which we've mentioned. It was an enormous success, not just as a book, but as Alfred Hitchcock's movie. There were also films of her books, Frenchman's Creek, My Cousin Rachel, and Jamaica Inn, and then adaptations of the short stories, The Birds and Don't Look Now. Rebecca was her biggest hit and has in some ways overshadowed her very long and varied career, and perhaps, especially for only the casual reader, has overshadowed some of the darkness and complexity to her work. Now, I would argue Rebecca is one of the darkest and most complex and underrated novels ever written, but these stories are openly thorny. So one thing I wanted to start with is just by asking each of you how you first came to read Daphne du Maurier. Was it through Rebecca? Was it in childhood? Was it in the air?
I think I probably read Rebecca when I was in middle school, and it made a strong impression on me. And I have read it subsequently, and of course I've seen the Hitchcock movie.
Yeah, I have a similar, I think I was in high school when I read it, and then I took a gothic class in college, and we really got into a lot of du Maurier's work. Yeah, and I always loved her. I'm a big fan of the sort of British Gothics.
I'm glad you brought up the word Gothic right away, because it's a term people toss around a lot. And actually, when I was reading in another excellent collection, which you put together, Joyce, you wrote in your introduction of American Gothic Tales, you want to make the distinction between this term Gothic writers. They're simply writers, after all. And you talk about the richness and magnitude of the Gothic grotesque vision and the inadequacy of genre labels, if by genre is meant mere formula. I think some of what we're talking about is that Daphne du Maurier was probably classified as a genre writer, with all that implies, and perhaps a women's writer as well. But diving into these stories, I think we'll find that's not at all the case. Now, Joyce, you said you were interested in talking about the birds from this collection.
Well, yes, I think what you're saying is so fascinating. And we can talk about the Gothic, in a few minutes. But to me, the Gothic is just sort of a fundamentally representative expression of consciousness. We spend many, many hours of our lives asleep, and we're in that realm of the unconscious where all sorts of images rush at us, which we can't control, and sometimes we can't even comprehend them. So to me, the Gothic is really an extension of realism, psychological realism. But I have a few words to say about the birds. Now, to me, the birds is her very best work. And I was sort of thinking about it just today, and it's one of the very first of the eco-horror works of fiction. Now, in the 21st century, it's quite common that we have eco-horror as a kind of entertainment, like the end of the world and so forth. But with the birds, if you substitute for the birds, who are very visual and cinematic, if you substitute like microorganisms like viruses and bacteria, it makes a lot of sense that it's almost like a parable about what can happen to our species if some other species rallies against it. So I'll just have this little introduction, and then we can go on with other subjects. Tales of the uncanny have traditionally fallen into two broad categories. Tales that lead the reader breathlessly along labyrinthine corridors, amounting suspense, anxiety, and dread to a full stop, a door that opens to a bricked-up doorway with nothing beyond the experience of the journey. And tales that lead the reader to doorways that open into vistas of profound revelation lingering long in the memory. In the first category are entertaining tales of the cheerfully macabre by such masters of the genre as Saki, John Collier, Roald Dahl, and occasionally Muriel Spark. Like episodes of The Twilight Zone, such stories tend to be anecdotal in tone, even satirical, dark magic tricks performed for their own virtuosic sake. But in the second category are classic tales of the uncanny that repay rereading for their subtlety, originality, and ambiguity. And here we find writers as varied as Hawthorne, Poe, Henry James, M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, H.G. Wells, Edith Wharton, H.P. Lovecraft, Shirley Jackson, and of course, Daphne du Maurier, to focus on the Anglo-American canon alone. So I'm sort of placing her in this category of macabre writers that nonetheless are visionaries rather than only entertainers.
I think it's important when talking about the birds to really distinguish between the source material and the, quite frankly, really goofy Alfred Hitchcock film, which involves the Tippi Hedren love story. This is, in fact, is a much more claustrophobic, tightly focused story of farmers in Cornwall who make their, as you say, they're living off of nature only to have nature turn on them. And it becomes increasingly tight-focused and claustrophobic and scary. It's actually a very deliberately executed drop-by-drop story. It has none of the cheap thrills, although it is violent. And it ends on a note of uncertainty, which even Hitchcock can only envy. It's a completely different animal, no pun intended.
Well, it's very brilliant because there's nothing romantic about it or sentimental in any way. And it's not even about human beings. It's more about a phenomenon of nature. And it has such wonderful prose. It's just, I've read it many, many times, and it's absolutely brilliant. I'll just quote some of this that I have. On December the 3rd, the wind changed overnight, and it was winter. Until then, the autumn had been mellow and soft. Great flocks of birds came to the peninsula, restless, uneasy, spending themselves in motion, now wheeling, circling in the sky, now settling to feed on the rich, new-turned soil. But even when they fed, it was as though they did without hunger, without desire. Restlessness drove them back to the skies again. Perhaps a message comes to the birds in autumn, like a warning. Winter is coming. Many of them perish. So you'll notice how her prose is just so musical in a kind of dreading way and suspenseful. And then she has short sentences that follow, like the starkness, but you can sort of see the birds. It's really, really excellent writing.
And the economy of describing their deviation by assuming their natural behavior, which is so beautifully observed. Now, what would you say is one of your favorites from this collection? I think you want to talk about Don't Look Now.
Yeah. For me, du Maurier is such a beautiful writer of place. Joyce and I were talking about this before, that setting is such a crucial part of how she unfolds a story. And in the case of Don't Look Now, for those who haven't seen the Nick Rogue movie or read the story, it's set in Venice. I won't give away the extremely shocking ending of this story, but basically a couple is haunted by the death of a child, and the husband, who comes off as something of a jerk in this story, believes that his wife is being tormented by a pair of, I mean, how would you describe them? Psychic twins.
Psychic identical twins, one of whom is blind.
Yeah, and Venice is such an interesting place to set a story like this because, you know, it's one of those places in the world where the veil feels very thin. not only is it floating on the water, there's the end that gives this fog and mist to the city. The streets are so labyrinthine and people get lost easily. And I wanted to read a little bit of what she wrote about Venice here. It's a conversation between the couple. I'll just read a little bit of it. They went out laughing into the warm, soft night, and the magic was about them everywhere. "Let's walk," he said. "Let's walk and work up an appetite for our gigantic meal." And inevitably they found themselves by the molo and the lapping gondolas dancing upon the water, the lights everywhere blending with the darkness. There were other couples strolling for the same sake of aimless enjoyment, backwards, forwards, purposeless, and the inevitable sailors in groups, noisy, gesticulating, and dark-eyed girls whispering, clicking on high heels. "The trouble is," said Laura, "walking in Venice becomes compulsive once you start. Just over the next bridge, you say, and then the next one, and beckons. I'm sure there are no restaurants down here. We're almost at the public gardens where they hold the Biennale. Let's turn back. I know there's a restaurant somewhere near the Church of San Zaccaria. There's a little alleyway leading to it." "Tell you what," said John, "if we go down here by the Arsenal and cross the bridge at the end and head left, we'll come upon San Zaccaria from the other side. We did it the other morning." "But it was daylight then. We may lose our way, and it's not very well lit." "Don't fuss. I have an instinct for these things." And as you can see, they're kind of having a conversation that's a little bit cyclical and sort of meandering and lost in its own way. They get lost. They come upon a bridge. She swears she's been there before. He gets lost in the canals and ends up being pursued by or pursuing this person he thinks is a child. And I really don't want to give away the end. It's so shocking.
Yes, if you have, I don't know if I call it a treat, but if you don't know
it's
the
one of the
ending-
most disturbing endings of a story ever, and it happens in the last 3 paragraphs.
Absolutely.
Suddenly you're like, "Whoop, okay."
Let's just say my 5-year-old has refused to do a Halloween costume surrounding it. Those of you who've seen the movie can appreciate what a loss this is to humanity.
But obviously, the undercurrent of the story is how grief makes you go crazy. But it's the fact that she sets it in a place where you feel like you're going crazy just by walking around, I think is just so brilliant, and the sense of place is so strong.
And then she sets another story, which you've collected here. Ganymede also takes place in a way that I
sort
think,
of gay reverie.
yes, which is a sort of kind of explicit echo of Death in Venice, about an older aesthete who goes to Venice. And it's one of the stories which I think it was 59 and was considered somewhat controversial because it's one of several stories which deals quite frankly with queer themes, which she did throughout her work. And in this collection, Ganymede is probably the most explicit, but then Not Before Midnight also certainly alludes to it, and I think is also having fun playing with kind of M.R. James themes of scholar aesthetes. But I think she does, to points both of you have made, really use the Gothic tradition as such, the way it's always been a vector for talking about queer subjects, the way it's often been a way of discussing the ancient and the spiritual in a way that's both more and less threatening to the common reader. And I think as a means of combining literary genres and being experimental in a clever and commercial manner. She was a very smart and successful businesswoman and writer as well. Loved swapping genres.
Well, she's very subversive because one of the predominant themes that goes through the stories is that the female is almost like a mystical being, that there are conventional women, but then there are women like, well, Rebecca would have been the most obvious one. But in this this novella, Monte Verita, which I think we all like, there's a woman who's mysterious, and I won't give away the plot because it's sort of an adventure story, but her husband looks upon her when she's in a new place, and he's appalled and horrified because she's not wearing conventional women's clothing. She had on a sort of tunic, he said, and most shocking, she had cut her hair so that she looked androgynous. Well, androgynous is my word. He says she looks sort of like a boy, and that's the this sort of predominant theme that's almost subterranean of how the woman who won't be the conventional woman is terrifying to the man.
In The Doll also, he describes her explicitly as having this boyish head, this boyish hair.
Yes.
And du Maurier herself would write in her letters about having this boy inside of her. Which
Yeah, she went by a boy's name as a child sometimes, alter ego. So she plays with gender in a really interesting way. I think in Monte Verita, I mean, the whole idea of again, not to give away the story, but the whole idea is there's this mountain that may or may not have a cult in it that's stealing the women from the town, and whether or not they go up there to sort of be in a lesbian separatist commune, but nobody really knows what's going on, and the mystery of the idea of these women being stolen or disappearing is so terrifying to the villagers and the people in town that there's something that they're doing up there.
It is such a marvelously bizarre novella. It's actually one of my favorite of her pieces, and I don't know how much you guys have read about the real Monte Verita in which she based it, but there was indeed this commune in the Swiss Alps, and far from being kind of inaccessible and semi-mystical, it was how would I put this? It was kind of full of anarchists, diet cranks, musicians, thinkers, utopian cooperatives, people who are very into something they called the nature healing sanctuary, sun, sanatorium, health movement, theosophists, free love advocates, Tolstoy devotees, and the rich people who love to fund and support them. So this was actually kind of a fashionable place for a few years. By the time she wrote the story, it had actually turned into kind of a really interesting ruin where you had still some of these 20s, you can find the pictures online and they're terrific, murals of kind of frolicking, idyllic, naked, indeed quite androgynous, Ganymede type people. And it clearly captured her imagination. But yes, definitely read Monte Verita. And this is one I recommend to everyone. And I'm so glad it's collected here, too, because it can be a little bit hard to find. Now, there were a couple of others I wanted to bring up, which really I haven't read discussed very much. I think it would be interesting, actually, to talk about exactly what we started with. This woman who wakes up in a hospital, eyes bandaged, has her bandages removed, and it's not giving away the twist. This is the story. To find each person she encounters is an animal. Each one a different animal. We don't know if this is expressing her feelings about them, something about their essential nature, whether she's seeing clearly for the first time. What she assumes is that everyone is playing an elaborate trick on her. And in several of these stories, characters feel that they have been plunged into nightmare worlds where everyone is in on something they're not.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were talking about the first person narration and the way that she makes it so that you can't trust the narrator, or maybe the narrator can't trust themselves, and they certainly don't trust anyone they encounter. There's just a lot of mistrust and the sense of, I don't know if I'm supposed to identify with this person, which is so interesting to do because I think so much first person narration, you're supposed to be identifying with that person. Like that's the person that you trust and you're going to go along the story with. And I feel like her narrators, you're often from the very beginning off on the wrong foot with them. You feel like, I'm not sure I can trust this person, or maybe they're crazy.
They're brusque, they're unpleasant, maybe they're crazy. At the very least, maybe you don't love the way they're speaking to the domestics around them. There's always a little bit of distance. And maybe that's good because sometimes something horrible is about to happen to them. but it's also a very interesting device. Which characters would you say you find sympathetic in this collection? I mean, Laura, I would say.
Yeah. Certainly not Rebecca. Not the Rebecca, the Rebecca of the doll.
The Rebecca of the doll, who's confusingly, or is it confusing, named Rebecca, is a completely different character, but a fascinating view onto the novel Rebecca. The doll, I would say, is probably the strangest story in here. Would you agree?
It's the earliest story, and she was only 20 when she wrote it, and I think that it had not been published before. So, as a writer, I wonder, in a sense, why it was in here, because it's much more sketchy, but maybe there's some logic to it. I thought it had wonderful passages of description, but it really isn't finished, so it's quite short. It doesn't bother me at all that characters are not sympathetic. I consider literature to be about great kind of visionary subjects, and you don't expect Macbeth and Captain Ahab to be sympathetic, or Raskolnikov, These are great themes, and the characters are participants or figures in the drama. So when Daphne du Maurier writes anything, it's a story. It's an uncanny tale. It's meant to throw us off a little bit and to be disturbing. So she puts people in it who serve that end of the narrative.
Well, we were talking in the green room beforehand about whether the heroine of Rebecca, her most famous work, is indeed a sympathetic POV character. And I was saying that on my first reading, I had very much experienced her that way, and that as I've read it, as I've gotten older, I've found my perceptions have changed, and she's become a much more sinister character to me, and I love that. I love that about the book, and that's another one which, if you've only read it once or haven't read it in a while, it so repays rereading. You'll see things you never saw before, for good and ill. And it is just the most delicious escapism I know, partly because it's horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, not to belabor Rebecca, because this is supposed, we're moving beyond Rebecca.
Not beyond
But
Rebecca.
what I really think is so interesting about that work is it's just like it seems to imply that nothing could be scarier to a woman than the idea of another woman. And like that feels so sharply drawn to me, that, that the actual horror is completely in your head, and the person that you're imagining could be better than you or stronger than you. And I think that's like such a, I mean, I think we all have this, but I think it's such a female coded like terror. And it's so finely drawn in that book. And I think in general, but what we were saying, women as mystical characters, this idea that there's some woman out there that you cannot understand, that there's like, they're opaque to you, and that's scary.
They're also like doppelgangers, that one woman is a more naive or younger version of another woman. Then at the very end of Monte Verita, we see at last, and it's rather cinematic, really, that this extremely beautiful woman, all these adjectives make her very, very beautiful. So we're almost a little tired of that, And then it's revealed that she has something like leprosy. She turns her face, and suddenly you feel that Daphne du Maurier is writing something about the tragic ambiguity of life, that we have a very limited vision, and then when we know more, we understand more of the full tragedy of life.
She, like, as in so many places, she kind of flirts with the mystical and the uncanny, and then makes it oddly matter-of-fact in the way. You're never sure where you stand, and whether they have merely risen to a plane where they can better accept death, and whether that's as good as magic, or whether there's actually something uncanny to this commune. Do read it. You'll really like it. Now, that reminds me very much. I was going to ask about, the Alibi. This being the story in which, this was not one I knew. Well, I think I'd read it once.
I didn't either.
This is essentially about a guy who sets out to murder a young woman and her son. And he finds this really down on their luck woman and child. The child's kind of tied up for most of the story. They're living in poverty. They're immigrants. And he's like, this is perfect. Gonna kill him. It's gonna be great. It's exactly what I'm looking for. And he comes up with this bizarre pretext whereby he's going to rent a very unprepossessing room in this shack and set himself up as an artist. And for whatever reason, this strikes him as a perfect alibi for the larger scheme of murdering them. It's never made quite clear, except that he's probably crazy. Things take off in unexpected and quite bizarre ways. But one thing that struck me about this is we have a convention when we talk about cozy mysteries in the trade. No animal or child is ever killed. She breaks all those rules. And that in itself is somewhat alarming. She is, I wouldn't say she's confined by any genre, but she is not afraid to break some of the cardinal rules of thriller writing. And this was before people knew they were opening up gritty thrillers and they knew everyone was what they were in for. And it was I imagine, quite shocking. I find it shocking, some of what she puts the children through. She makes childhood a very vulnerable place and a very scary place. And I wonder if you were struck by that. I just hated that boy being tied up, let alone the end.
Well, I find with you that the Alibi is a fascinating story. I think I probably read it a little differently than you read it. But let me read this paragraph, which when I first read it, I was struck by this extremely stark epiphany. So a husband and wife are walking along, and they're just middle-aged, and I guess supposed to be sort of like average people. Which way, asked his wife, and he looked at her without recognition, seized with the overwhelming, indeed appalling impression that she and all the other people crossing the bridge were minute dangling puppets manipulated by a string. The very steps they took were jerking, lopsided, a horrible imitation of the real thing, of what should be, and his wife's face was nothing but a mask painted rapidly by a master hand that held the puppets on the strip of lifeless wood from which these marionettes were fashioned. When I read that, I thought this is just an absolutely chilling vision of looking at someone who should be intimate with you and sort of not thinking that person's even normal, even a human being.
It's like a disassociation or a
completely
disambiguation of the...
But then the story becomes a parable of the artist, because the man's idea of escape is to do something different. So break the sort of pantomime charade of his life by killing someone. So that what came to his mind. But then, as an alibi, he pretends to be an artist. So he knows nothing about art, but he actually starts being an artist. He's painting, and he gets so engrossed with that act of creation, and also with the woman he thought he was going to kill, that he's transformed. And I have never read a story like that. It seems to be that Daphne du Maurier is saying that by the act of creation, maybe her own writing, she's being moved from one level of being that's destructive and small-minded to a higher level of being where she's creating. And then he gets more and more emotionally involved with this woman and her child. So to me, the story was really a revelation in itself.
I think certainly what you say about the act of creation, both that his artistry turns from murder to literal art, but then, as you say, it goes from a very bald story of one kind to a completely different act of creation. And also the fact that she is manipulating these painted puppets and then acknowledging it up front. And this is a story in which the narrator in particular plays God, wouldn't you say, just given the mechanics of without giving away too much.
Well, you never know where she's going. I think that's one thing about Daphne du Maurier. She will have surprise endings. So there's a surprise ending, and it's really counterintuitive. It's not what you expect. And that's why she's a great writer.
And I think that when you were saying breaks all the conventions, I think that's why I like the short stories so much, because they're short. Like, you honestly, she doesn't torture anybody for too long. But also this surprise ending, it's like they're the perfect length. I find these stories to be so satisfying, because it's like you sit down, you're incredibly disturbed, and then there's a twist and it's over. It's like this, it's a very satisfying experience to read these stories.
Do you think you can read them all in a sitting? Or I really feel like they're too delicious and you kind of have to meet them out a little bit.
I wouldn't recommend reading this whole book all the way through, no. I think one story a day is probably the best. See, this is not a book that the author put together. With a selected short stories that the author has created, you will often find a sort of a narrative or a theme, so that you might be able to read it all the way through like a book of poetry. But this is a collected, not exactly collected, but many, many stories of hers. They were all written at different times, and they're not in chronological order. So you're not seeing anything like a development. It's better, I think, just to read each story at least like one a day and then think about it.
I also think it's interesting, as you say, they were written over decades, so it's worthwhile to just go to the index and see when each was published, because they range from something like The Doll, which was the late 20s, to the 60s.
Science fiction.
The science fiction element, which is actually kind of what I wanted to. I don't know how we're doing on time, but I thought that was a kind of good place to end, because I was thinking about how, there are trends in horror and mystery, certainly. We had the Victorian era kind of gave birth to Sherlock Holmes and rationalism and the kind of scary stories we like. People want a different kind of a neat Agatha Christie puzzle box mystery after World War I. After World War II, we had kind of all these noir anti-heroes. This is an oversimplification, but there are certainly trends in, not just in publishing, but in public tastes about what reflects our anxieties and which paradoxically become a kind of escapism, I think. I always like to read ghost stories, the occult, whatever you want to term it, especially du Maurier, when I find things in the world stressful and overwhelming, which I think is interesting because she doesn't give us very many answers or tie anything up. And I don't know if you felt this at all or what you feel the appeal is. I think for me, perhaps it's just feeling the unusual sensation of being in such safe literary hands.
Well, I could just say one word. You had to go back to Don't Look Now, which is probably her second greatest story. You said that the character, at least the woman, went crazy with grief. I actually didn't read it that way at all. I didn't see that there was any supernatural thing involved except the psychics of the psychic sister. And to me, it was extremely interesting how one might imagine a future for someone if you meet the person without it being actually a prefiguring of the future. That is a kind of seeing of these people, the couple lost in grief, seeing that the woman is aggrieved, and then projecting, if you were sensitive, a kind of narrative. So the surprise of the movie, which is not, it's not as effective in prose. The movie's it's a very cinematic story. The surprise of the movie is very visual. And you see this little, seeming like a little child dressed in red. And the red is very striking, sort of like blood red in among the gray colors of Venice. And then at the end of the movie, there's one of the most famous jump scares in film history. So when you see it in the movie, it's stunning. Now, when you read about it in prose, it's effective too, but nothing like the movie. So that when you're seeing the movie, you're really seeing these things and you know they're real because you're seeing them. So I don't see that the woman has been, made crazy by grief. She may have a deeper insight.
I was thinking more he was, because there was a repression there. I like his suspicions to me seem like they're an offloading of his own inability to deal with the death of a child.
I'd agree, and he's using as the man feels he has to take care of her and is busying himself, but clearly as a means of not dealing with it himself. Even the way he speaks to the doctor about how she can't get over the daughter's death.
Well, he's hyper-rational. So the characters sort of fall into somebody who's very emotional and one who's hyper-rational. But his hyper-rationality doesn't save him.
No.
Well, the opposite.
Well, no.
Whereas the woman survives.
I mean, what you're saying about the escapism versus like why would we read these stories? I mean, obviously, I think people like to be scared, but what you were saying about being in really safe literary hands, I mean, when you read du Maurier, you're scared, but you're also so impressed. It's almost like you forget that you're reading something. It's so skillful and the prose is so delicious, like you were saying, that you're almost lulled into the sense of like, where's the jump scare coming? And then when it comes, it's always surprising. So I think that's something wonderful. Because I also can never, like Joyce was saying, there's a lot of ways you never know where she's going. Like, so much writing, even some of the best horror or psychological thrillers, you kind of have a sense of like what's coming around the bend, even though you're scared to go there, but you know what's coming. There are so many of the endings of these stories where you just are like, I don't know how we got from A to B, but I'm glad we're here.
Then there's another story of hers that's not in this book called Kiss Me Again, Stranger, one of the very great titles. Kiss Me Again, Stranger, and that was the title of one of her collection of stories. That story is very, very good. It's a first-person, well, it's not a first-person narrative, but it feels like it, and then there's a first-person narrative within it, sort of a monologue of a woman who's has evil intentions, so that the man is like the victim, men are the victims, and the woman is the predator. Kiss Me Again, Stranger.
I think it was in one of the New York Review reissued collections.
Yes,
about
you're
the
right.
last
I
10
have
years.
that.
So,
With Patrick McGraw was the editor. Yes.
so you'll be able to find it.
Yeah, I was wondering why that story wasn't in this collection because it's, to me, probably her second greatest story.
I mean, there's so many good ones when you get into it. And I was really glad, actually, especially to have the collection end on the story. Another one I don't think I'd ever read, The Breakthrough,
I never read that.
which is one of the, as you say, more sci-fi adjacent stories, and unfortunately felt AI relevant. I hate to even say it, but
Everything does.
I know.
Well, I have to confess, I really didn't like that story so much. To me, Daphne du Maurier is just a brilliant writer of setting scenes in a very visceral way so that you're seeing scenes and there's a lot of emotional resonance. But the science fiction story of hers, I guess narrated by a man, it doesn't really take place in a kind of geographically rich soil that her other stories take place.
I agree. She's at her best when it's more rooted in place.
Rooted in place, yes.
But of course, you read lines like this, and you can't help but, well, immortality in some form or other becomes a certainty. The whole meaning of life on earth is changed, says one of these guys. Yes, I thought, changed forever. The fusion of science and religion in a partnership, at first joyous, then the inevitable disenchantment, the scientist realizing, and the priest with him, that, with eternity assured, the human being on earth is more easily expendable.
Bleak.
Well, this the sort of thing that H.G. Wells was doing in his exemplary short novels. But I don't know, I would wonder why she wrote that, because it's sort of not her thing, and she doesn't have the whole repertoire of her strengths.
It's not my favorite either, but I love that she played so many genres, and I like The House on the Strand, which moves in certain unadvisedly groovy directions, I would say at times, but I still think has some of the du Maurier magic. Yeah, and we'd love to take some questions from you all. It can be about any of the books. Lindsay.
Thank you so much for talking about this. I admittedly have only read Rebecca and have seen some of the movies you guys mentioned. But from you were talking about the book, it made me think that there was some resonance with Patricia Highsmith, and I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about that, or if you agree. And it's kind of interesting that they have such different biographies that they would kind of tend in a similar direction.
That's such a good question. I actually don't think either one of them would have been affected by the other. That is, probably Daphne du Maurier had not read Highsmith, but Highsmith would have read Daphne du Maurier. They seem to be quite different, but I don't know.
I guess, of course, she would have read her, just as a matter of statistical probability. I don't know much about their intersection, and that's actually something I'd like to know much more about.
Well, Highsmith is more of a realist, and Daphne du Maurier has her roots in kind of gothic writing, you know.
Although she also does a lot with place, which might well have been informed by it. Certainly,
Right, you have a lot of people wandering around Europe feeling kind of freaked out.
God knows you've got
Feels like there's some similarities
there's
there.
some paranoia happening in the old world.
Well, the lesbian theme is definitely in common, yeah, very much.
More explicit, maybe in Highsmith, or
Much more explicit, but very powerful and subterranean in du Maurier. I would say she was probably bisexual in her actual life, but she couldn't admit to that because she had a conventional husband and a family and so forth. So that gives a lot of power. It's sort of like Oscar Wilde writing, you know, the picture of Dorian Gray gets its power by being kind of a subversive text.
Did she have an affair with Gertrude Lawrence while the latter was filming The King and I in New York? We will never know for sure. Some say yes, some say no.
Yes, it's called ambiguity.
Exactly.
Which is a good thing.
Exactly.
We know too much about too many people today. It's better to have mystery.
There's quite a bit of mystery about her, considering how well documented her life is.
Yes, and the saddest thing I read about her, which I've been thinking about, that when she was losing her creative power when she was older, and what I read in the biography, I guess, is that she no longer really cared about living. That she lost her will to live because she wasn't writing anymore. But this is a woman who had children, and she had friends and a family. And I just thought that, I just felt very sad to think that she lost her will to live because she couldn't write anymore. Do you know anything about that? Have you read?
I know she became very reclusive. I know she was drinking a lot. Actually,
Oh, she's drinking.
Highsmith too. Yeah,
But
actually.
that's so sad
Yeah.
because she's got this rich imagination that's almost unstoppable and so dramatic. And then to think of her losing that, maybe I just identified with it or something.
But there's always been that vein of real distrust of humanity that runs through her work, which
Yes.
makes it so good. And maybe at the end that won out.
Yes,
Do you think she was a misanthrope?
I mean,
probably. Well, we know that Patricia Highsmith was.
yeah, not maybe the Highsmith levels, but
She didn't like
the
anybody.
right amount.
She didn't even like women. Otto Penzler, who is the owner of the Mysterious Bookstore, he was her first publisher, I think, in the United States. And he just admired her writing so much, but he will just shake his head. She was the nastiest person he ever met. Whereas I think Daphne du Maurier is much more ladylike and gracious and quite different.
Yeah, I think
And she had a very long time relationship with her editor that was very close and
always a good sign.
yeah,
Yes.
who's believed in her and published, I think, 4 of her books before he got Rebecca on his desk and knew he had a hit. So he
that's
he was a champion of her work even when it wasn't selling, and then very excited when he got a manuscript that he knew the minute he read it, he said, "This is going to be a bestseller."
That's so good.
Yeah.
Now, we should possibly address the question, speaking of ambiguities, possible plagiarism of Rebecca. Was it, in fact, based on an Argentine novel of a very, quite similar book, which she had seen? It's inconclusive. Rebecca is a very different book at the end of the day. Again, we don't know for sure. It wasn't something of an issue at the time.
Was it really? I didn't know that. But I would think Jane Eyre is a more obvious predecessor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
who can, once you start going down that road, well, I think there was some sense that she had been shown a pre-published manuscript and wasn't
Well,
thought very about
I
it.
didn't know about that, but that's interesting because how long did it take her to write it? I mean, sometimes, oddly enough, you sometimes see movies that come out around the same time on the same subjects, almost like Capote. But it takes so long to write a novel or, make a movie that there's no influence at all. It's something that's sort of in the air. Or they could even have a common source, as I said, like Jane Eyre, much more obvious template.
You were asking about other reasons she might have kind of given up at the end. If memory serves, she kept trying to write kind of dutiful family biography, which wasn't coming as easily to her. And I believe the book Marianne, about an ancestor of hers who had been a 19th century consort, was particularly unpleasant and boring for her to write. And she just felt she had lost the ease and pleasure of it.
Why was she writing that?
She felt, I'm sure you've read the same biographies I have, but she, in this biographer's opinion, felt a great sense of family pride and obligation. And hers was such an interesting family with, as many families of writers, I think they were very steeped in self-mythologizing. And
Well, she's just a normal writer, wants to imagine things. But if you're writing a biography, you have to have a historical authenticity, which is so boring compared to the flights of fancy. She probably felt trapped.
of course, yes, and she's in the archives. I mean, this was not what she wanted at all.
Too bad.
And also, she was really, really sad about losing that house. Menabilly, which people think is almost
Manderley.
certainly Manderley, although it's not as grand, but it was this Georgian mansion that she rented for 20 years, never owned. She did restore it completely. She loved it. She restored the azalea gardens. She had to move out. The heirs claimed it back, and
What?
that was a great loss to her.
It's
and a
strange.
heartbreak.
Strange you didn't buy it. She must have been a millionaire. She had plenty of money.
She had
did-
enough to fix it up, but it was entailed.
How very odd. Well, she could have bought another comparable house. I didn't know that. I just feel, that's so sad. She loved her house. Yeah.
She dreamed she went back to Menabilly.
Well, in the Patricia Highsmith novel, something would have happened to the owner of the house. A happy ending for the writer.
Exactly. Now, other questions?
Hi. You made mention earlier tonight that maybe du Maurier has been dismissed as a genre writer or, God forbid, a popular writer, and perhaps hasn't always gotten the recognition that she deserved, like in the same literary pantheon as some of her contemporaries. Especially since, like, we see new publications coming out now and everything. Do you feel like that's starting to change? And do you think, if that's true, that it's because of her talent, sort of showing the test of time, or maybe more because of a larger turn in opinion about genre writing in general, Gothic writing, or that sort of thing?
Well, she was really bothered by it in her lifetime. She knew she wasn't taken seriously as a writer, and it might be why she experimented with so many genres, and maybe why she was trying straight biography. Unfortunately, I think everything. Wouldn't you say? I would think just the sheer quality of her work, how well it stands up.
Well, I think completely because she was a woman. When Stephen King writes a novel, if it's a little bit like Rebecca, it's a man's novel, because the man has written it. But when a woman writes anything, if a woman had written War and Peace, somebody would have been quibbling and saying, well, a woman did this, it's second rate. We know from looking at the reviews of Jane Eyre, and Charlotte Bronte published her work under pseudonym, and the first reviews were excellent because they thought a man had written it. But in the second wave of reviews, when they knew a woman had written, suddenly they started finding flaws and fault with it. Yeah, it's pretty obviously misogyny. I would say that's it. Anyone who wrote The Birds is a brilliant writer. There's nothing that suggests it's a woman's story at all.
But I think what you were saying about the larger sort of energy around genre writing right now feels very apropos. I mean, genre writing is keeping the publishing industry afloat right now. I mean, thrillers, romance, horror, sci-fi, romantasy. I mean, these are the genres that right now are selling, and I think people are unabashed about their love for these genres. I think obviously there's, to bring the Gen Z, it's like book talk, all these things, the way in which people are able to proudly talk about the reading communities that they're in without feeling like, they have to apologize for those. I mean, there's specialty bookstores opening all the time. Just last week, a horror bookstore called The Twisted Spine opened in Williamsburg. It's the first horror bookstore in New York. There's the Ripped Bodice. There's all these bookstores that are catering to these communities where it's proudly about the genre. So I think you're right that maybe there is going to be a resurgence of classic horror, classic scary writing. And what I think people will find when they look into du Maurier's work is not only is it like satisfying on the level of genre writing, but it's also just really solid, powerful literary writing, which I think is part of the reason that her work has stood the test of time.
Absolutely. But I mean, there was like bad genre that hasn't survived. And she's
Pulp Fiction for the most part has not been reclaimed.
and you read her, and it's
She's so much better. She's much better writer than Agatha Christie, for instance.
Shots fired.
I mean, just the prose, looking at, literary prose.
that's true.
I mean, there's no question. I don't think Agatha Christie was interested in writing like poetic metaphors and things like that.
She's a good plotter.
Well, that's what I said. Daphne du Maurier also has brilliant plots, but they're not formulaic in any way, and she's just a better writer. I mean, it's like saying that James Joyce is a better writer than somebody. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think, pretty evident if you read them.
Yeah, I wouldn't even compare them, but Daphne du Maurier is great, and you don't need. But I will also say you don't need to like genre at all to love her work, and I think she for so many years was her publishers pushed her in that direction too, and her work was obviously not. She was doing everything she could to escape this idea of romantic suspense, and you can see that here. She was killing children. She had murderous dwarves. I mean, this was, what more did she have to do?
No, I agree completely. I think she's a very androgynous writer. I think she used some of the tropes of women's writing in the beginning because she wanted to sell her books, but I think her imagination was very androgynous.
I'm curious. So I'm seeing that this book was introduced by Stephen King, and since he is one of the most famous genre writers and male writers, how would you all say that either adds to or negates from the legacy of Daphne du Maurier's work?
I think it's always going to move units to have a Stephen King introduction. I mean, yeah. And I thought from his introduction that some of these stories were new to him, and he seemed very impressed.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very enthusiastic, positive introduction, which is what you do, you know. Yeah. Patrick McGraw has an introduction to his collection that's much more analytical and much more like psychoanalytical. So he makes the point, which I think is evident. He makes points that Stephen King isn't even thinking about, that in these short stories, she was really experimental. And she was trying things that she hadn't done before that really were unexpected. While in her novels, because she wanted to be a bestseller, if you have a publisher, they actually do want your books to sell. But in short fiction, you can do much more experimental things.
And I think I don't think that having Stephen King introduce these stories negates the legacy whatsoever. I think in many ways, it's lovely that he's able to sort of note the things that he took from her. And especially he talks about her ability to write a twist. And of course, that is something that he prides himself on as well. And so I think there's some interesting lineage that he's pulling from and saying, nobody writes twists like this. Every single story ending was a surprise to me. I jumped, I screamed. And these are things that are very important to him. So I think, you know, he's presenting himself as a student at her feet, which I think is an important way to position.
Absolutely. He's also very gentlemanly and very welcoming, and he's a great person.
Did you feel like it put you off the book or made you want to read it more?
No, I'm interested in specifically the male members of my family being more drawn to it. Daphne du Maurier, my mom and I love her, but the male members of my family would be more drawn to it. So I think in that way,
Great.
Smart move.
in some ways it would bring, yeah, that's why I was really interested in the adding to or negating from part of the question, because I think it can do both. I definitely see the rise in genre writing as gaining validity in the States, which I appreciate as a fan of genre writing and popular fiction as well. But I think it is an interesting conversation, because I also enjoy Stephen King's work myself.
There you go.
Time for one more? Do we have a question? Sure.
Yeah, so you had both mentioned earlier that you had read Rebecca or Daphne du Maurier's work generally when you were in middle school and high school. I'm just curious, like, what about her work spoke to you at that like particular young age?
I was given Rebecca for Christmas when I was 12 by my mom, and to read it from the opening line is to be drawn in. At that level, it was in some ways a superficial reading. But the plot alone is enough, and the sense of identification with an alienated, shy main character is very appealing. Or it certainly was to me.
Well, I wouldn't be able to even remember my earliest reading of it, but I think it's a great example of a somewhat unreliable narrator. She sees and reports on things that the reader is interpreting differently than she is. So that's very, very good, very dramatic, I think.
And yeah, I'm trying to think of why I first read it. Probably because I wasn't really able to watch scary movies, and so I read scary books. And I think I probably had a librarian recommend this one to me, which is how I found all my favorite things. But I was also on a real jag of reading, like, Jane Eyre and anything that kind of happened with like a misty mansion and more. I was that kind of girl sitting in the window.
Gothic. Love the Gothic. So is that?
That's a lovely note to end on. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you all so much for being here.